Our next presenter is Professor Tanja Zimmermann from a town which is very important for Čiurlionis, Leipzig, right? And she will give the analysis of Čiurlionis' reception after his death and how it changed from mental illness interpretations to some synthesis of arts. And the stage is all yours.
Thank you very much. Yesterday, Philip Ross-Bullock already presented some excerpts from Ivanov and Petritakis about Lehmann, and today I will proceed with some other aspects of this art criticism. Between 1911 and 1914, Russian art criticism undertook a comprehensive re-evaluation of the work of Naujas Čiurlionis, who, having begun his career as a composer, devoted his later years in St. Petersburg primarily to painting before his death in a psychiatric hospital close to Warsaw. His original style, which by his contemporaries could not be clearly assigned to any dominant artistic tradition, was interpreted in various ways. First, as the work of a mentally ill or a poorly trained artist close to folklore, and later as a forerunner of synthetic avant-garde art. In the following, I want to analyze the shift in the evaluation of his paintings in the context of media change, a process that many other artists on the margins, particularly self-sought and mentally ill or so-called outsider artists of the 20th century underwent. The early 1910s marked a period when various avant-garde movements in literature, art, music, and theater were emerging and gaining prominence in the Russian metropolises. In St. Petersburg, the music theater performance Victory of the Sun was staged in December 1913, an allegory of the destruction of the old aesthetic order in which the sun is carried to its grave, veiled by a curtain with Kazimir Malevich's Black Square. The text by Velimir Chlebnikov and Alexei Kruchonych was performed in the trans-rational Zaum language, accompanied by a mixture of noises and popular tunes composed by Mikhail Matyushin. In Moscow, the exhibition The Target Mission in spring 1913, organized by Mikhail Larionov, not only featured works by the Cubo-futurists, but also, for the first time, paintings by the self-taught artist Niko Pirosmanashvili, whom the Zdanevich brother had discovered in the taverns of Tbilisi. At the same time, a significant shift can be observed in the reception of Čiurlionis' art. His critics, who came from symbolist circles, would soon yield the stage to the emerging forces of the revolutionary avant-garde. In what follows, I will first present brief excerpts from contemporary art criticism that illustrate the crucial passages underlying this evaluation. Then I would like to situate this transformation within the broader context of the media transformation from symbolism to avant-garde. Could you now show the next page of my presentation? Thank you. So, the beginning. Mentally ill artists from the province of the Russian Empire. Immediately after his death, Sergei Makovsky, a symbolist poet, art critic, member of the World of Art group and founder of the St. Petersburg Salon, as well as editor of the leading symbolist art journal Apollon, published an obituary in his honor. In it, he acknowledges Čiurlionis' dual gift as painter and musician, prizing his early landscapes with musical titles, his delicate in coloring and painterly harmonies, in which he recognizes sometimes the influence of Japanese painting. However, according to Markowski, this is not the usual Japonism, but a rather peculiar fusion of intimate lyricism, the kakemono style, and motives of Lithuanian folk art. However, the art critic finds Čiurlionis later enigmatic hallucinatory paintings, as he calls them, less convincing, remarking that they were not for sober, skeptical souls. To illustrate the difference between Čiurlionis' early, still positively received musical painters and later hallucinations, he quotes from a letter by Vyacheslav Ivanov, a poet, playwright, and theorist of Russian symbolism. In the letter, Ivanov divides the artist's work into two phases: an early phase in which he intuitively painted a musical flowing chaos, and later phase characterized by crystal clear geometric forms. In these forms, Markowski sees an attempt to give invisible, transcendental form a concrete shape, an endeavor he believes is doomed to fail. He compares it to the impossibility of transferring the hyperbolic geometry of the mathematician Nikolai Lobachevsky, who will be very important for the avant-garde and fourth dimension later, into the static geometric world of Euclid. Additionally, he notes strong echoes of other works, artworks in Čiurlionis' work, thereby implying his epigonalism, though without naming them specifically. His critique ultimately culminates in the assessment of Čiurlionis' late work as a manifestation of his mental illness. However, the illness, the episodes of mental disorders that had troubled him earlier became chronic during these years, and Nicolaus Konstantinos was admitted to a sanatorium for nervous disorders in Czerwony Dwór near Warsaw, where there was hope for treatment. He suddenly passed away here on March 18 due to the brain hemorrhage and was buried in the Rasos cemetery in Vilnius. Markowski concludes his text with mixed praise. Čiurlionis is primarily an important co-founder of the still young Lithuanian culture. He recognizes the Lithuanian national character in his paintings, which he sees in the epic fairy tale style of his legend and the lyricism of Lithuanian primitivism. It is precisely this national foundation, as he says, nacionalная почва, and the close connection to Lithuanian folk art that will ensure the continuation of his art. By declaring Čiurlionis a singer of his people, Markowski simultaneously excludes him from the artistic development in St. Petersburg and other European metropolises and their high culture of the turn of the century. From the imperial perspective of Russian capital, he situates Čiurlionis within the peripheral and folkloristic context of the Lithuanian province. Now, I would ask you for the second folio. Now it comes Lehmann, the occult painter exploring transcendent words. A year later, the first short Russian language monograph of Čiurlionis, written by the symbolist poet and anthroposophist Boris Lehmann, was published. Lehmann prefaced it, as you mentioned already yesterday, with a Neoplatonic quote from the famous religious philosopher Vladimir Solovyov, in which shadows and reflections are interpreted as visualization of the invisible and sounds as the echoes of heavenly polyphony. Lehmann thus views Čiurlionis' mental illness from as a form of a transcendence into hidden supernatural realms, which he associates with the early religions of ancient Egypt and Persia. In the rhythmic structure of Čiurlionis' sonatas, Lehmann searches for analogies between musical tones and patches of colors, placing the artist within a long tradition of such experiments. Leonardo da Vinci, Franz Karel von Eckarthausen, Scriabin's music poem Prometheus, and Margaret Watts Hughes you presented extensively yesterday. Therefore, I won't go into details. He understands rhythm, typical for the time of symbolism, as a universal cosmic musical principle that connects everything. As such, it serves as a foundation for the unification of different arts, including music, poetry, visual arts, dance, and theater. Rhythm, as understood as a principle of movement that generates repetition of elements and patterns, gained popularity from 1912 onwards, partly through the influence of the Swiss music educator Émile Jacques Dalcroze, who offered courses in rhythmic gymnastic in St. Petersburg. This is a year later, after his death. Lehmann also mentions Čiurlionis readings, Kant, Nietzsche, then Dostoevsky, E.T.A. Hoffmann, fantastic literature. So he's an intellectual, not a painter with a peasant background, but according to Lehmann, also the onset of Čiurlionis' illness may even have expanded the artist's perception. However, the neurologist Vladimir Bichteryov advised his wife a psychiatric clinic. There, the artist suffered a crisis and died as a result of brain hemorrhage. Now we go to the next page, to the third page, and to Čiurlionis as a forerunner, a pioneer of avant-garde synthesis. On the third anniversary of that, in 1914, Vyacheslav Ivanov offered a new reading that decisively reshaped the artist's reception. He framed Čiurlionis' oeuvre as a synthesis of painting and music, in which the temporal, kinetic nature of music stood in deliberate tension with the special, static character of visual art, producing an antinomic aesthetics. You were yesterday mentioning the Laocoon, and I want to perceive this critic more from the avant-garde perspective. Precisely because this hybrid form, Čiurlionis' work was widely misunderstood. Consequently, he was excluded from the dominant narratives of art history, condemned to a state of homelessness, бездомничество, cultural isolation, kulturное одиночество, terms frequently applied to self-sought or marginal and outside artists. Comparing him to the Russian poet Fyodor Tyutchev and the philosopher Nietzsche, Ivanov casts all three as hermits with a magical world in their soul, isolated figures who had lost touch with their contemporaries and were viewed as prodigal sons in every home. Čiurlionis' synthetic art demands, Ivanov argued, a somewhat foolish soul, немного юродивее, and an almost religious communal consciousness, соборное сознание, attainable only through a process of displacement and shift. He uses the expression zdvig. Mental illness and religious occultism thus emerged as a vehicle for transforming perception, rendering the self receptive to synthetic intermediate art. In evoking zdvig, shift, displacement, Ivanov anticipated the avant-garde movements that would only a few years later adopt this concept as a central strategy to challenge conventional perception, from cubism to collage, assemblage, and so on, and intermedia discussion. The term denoted incongruence across multiple levels of a work, extending even to inter- and transmedia relation within the system of arts. I don't have time to go to Valerian Chudovsky, who also wrote his critique in this year in the same number of Apollon, but I want to summarize these findings. By downplaying Čiurlionis' mental illness and emphasizing his synthesis of the art, Ivanov and also Chudovsky initiated a discursive shift mirrored in contemporary debates on synesthesia. From the late 19th to the early 20th century, synesthesia was perceived as anomaly or degeneration of sensory experience, often linked to mental illness. After psychological and physiological explanations faltered, the synesthetic perception was linked to pseudo-scientific occult fields such as theosophy and anthroposophy, as well as to non-European religious philosophies from Orient and Far East. It's the same way of reception, the synesthesia, although Čiurlionis was not a synesthetic artist in this sense. With the beginning of the avant-garde movements, when intermediate artists assumed a central role, synesthesia became normalized as a marker of creativity, overcoming the fragmentation of senses as experienced in new technologies and as a photography, silent film, telegraph, telephone, and phonograph, and the artist was that full, complete medium of all arts. Simultaneously, the reception of mentally ill artists, so marginal artists, outsider artists, underwent a profound transformation. Initially, figures such as Cesare Lombroso or Max Nordau pathologized artistic creativity, linking genius to nervous instability or generation. Lombroso, Ingegno e Follia, framed exceptional artistic achievements as a deviant manifestation of mental illness and a symptom of degeneration, while Nordau's Degeneration and Artung interpreted modern movements, including Impressionism, Symbolism, Art Nouveau, and the reception of non-European art as a symptomatic of sensory fragmentation and urban decadence. According to Nordau, such artists suffered impaired perception and regressive tendencies, exemplified in synesthetic experiments and the blending of text and image, which counteracted the drive toward differentiations. So, both criminalized modernist art, perceiving it as neurological abnormalities. But now, during the 1920s, the psychiatrist Hans Prinzhorn, who had studied art history, philosophy, and singing, began collecting so-called artistry, Bildnerei, by the mentally ill. He examined their inherent rules, such as the drive for ornamentation, which could transition into unstructured, object-free scribbling and culminate in symbolically abstract formulas with metaphysical meaning, as well as the all-pervading rhythm, which could solidify into ragged order. In his book, Artistry of the Mentally Ill, Contribution to the Psychology and Psychopathology of Form, he sharply criticized the equation of contemporary avant-garde art with that of the mentally ill. Rather, artists like the Expressionists would study such works and look for structural analogies. Simultaneously, Surrealist artists valorized mental illness as supreme source of creative inspiration and artistic liberation. This recognition reached a zenith in the exhibition Fantastic Art, Dada and Surrealism at Museum of Modern Art in New York in the middle of the 30s, while under National Socialism in Nazi Germany, such works were once again condemned as degenerate. Organized by Alfred Baer Jr. and Georges Huguenot, the exhibition presented art of the insane, alongside self-sought creations, including works containing surrealist elements, such as Henri Rousseau's The Dream. These pieces were employed as comparative material to contextualize contemporary modernism, highlighting formal and conceptual affinities between outside and avant-garde practices. Self-sought art and outside art were perceived as precursors or fellows of avant-garde artists. A similar discursive shift occurred in the reception of Čiurlionis, recasting him from a mentally ill and poorly skilled artist, marginalized within the artistic system, into a visionary pioneer of intermedia arts. Can you show the next folio? However, unlike contemporaries such as Vasily Kandinsky and Scriabin, Čiurlionis did not pursue a synesthesis of the arts through synesthesia, but in a very original way via graphic linear means. We spoke about it already yesterday. This brief insight into the Russian art criticism and the reception of Čiurlionis reveals how the transformation of the entire system, artistic system, its transition from symbolist aesthetic to avant-garde aesthetic, reshaped the evaluation of artwork that could not easily be integrated in the mainstream canon. He was not canonical, and one, he's a marginal, and then he's a pioneer. Artistic phenomena at the margins of the system were thus interpreted either as a modernist form, modest form of creativity, close to folklore, children drawings. Later we will find also association of Čiurlionis art with children drawings, or creations of the mentally ill, or conversely as pioneering works of art. In this regard, Čiurlionis shared a fate with the self-sought and outsider artist with whom he was frequently associated. Viewed through the lens of post-colonial art history, his artistic work represents a case of multiple modernities, historically suppressed by the prevailing imperial evaluation of the colonized periphery. And this situation repeats during his late receptions in the Lithuanian art history. He's a national artist, and this is a re-evaluation, positive evaluation of folklorist elements. And during the 70s, when he's again recepted in the Soviet Union, they again mention he's a musician, and this is the way how it is possible to present some forms of abstraction and non-figurative art in the Soviet Union, where the aesthetics of socialist realism was so long dominant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Zimmermann, and we still have 10 minutes for discussions and questions. So, does anybody have any questions?
I have a question for the first speaker before me. Makowski in 1911 mentioned that some elements of Japanese aesthetics in Čiurlionis' work, and I wanted to know how these elements of Japanism, of peculiar Japanism according to Makowski, played this element of art criticism any role at the reception in Japan, so that he was perhaps a little bit more familiar for them for these features.
Okay, thank you very much, but we do not have the first speaker online, and I think the best person who can answer your question is Professor Andrijauskas, who so the author of a presentation cannot answer them. Yeah, but
Thank you so much, Professor Zimmermann, for that. I'm trying to turn an observation into a question. I was really struck by your story there because it reminds me so much of the evolving discussion around the figure of Modest Mussorgsky, who in the 19th century had been sort of dismissed as self-taught, inadequate, and even within the Russian national circles, he had to be re-edited by Rimsky to be acceptable. But of course, in this period, there is the debate about editing him in accordance with his manuscripts, and so that he becomes, as it were, an internal outsider. So 1908, the Paris in Paris, you get Maria Eilenina Dahlheim singing the songs in Petersburg and in Paris and Moscow. And I just was really struck by the comparison between an emerging discourse of art, which belongs to the Yurodivy, or the less taught, rather than, and the language of Yurodivy there so recalls both the content of Mussorgsky's operas, but also the discourse that shaped him. So, as you can see, it was more of a commentary than a question. But typologically, there seems to be something very similar in the discussion of the two artists.
Absolutely. There are separate ways when the revolutionary avant-garde starts in the Soviet Union, because then they don't appreciate Čiurlionis' avant-gardism, but they say he belongs to bourgeois art, and the whole bourgeois art was degenerated. So there are different ways of reception in East and West. So, but he is then recepted again during the late 60s and 70s when the naive art, so-called naive art and outside art became popular in this context. So thank you for your comment.
Okay, any more questions? Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor Zimmermann. I have a question regarding his reception as a degenerate artist, a decadent. Have you found in the discourses some comparison with Albert Welti? He was Albert Welti. He was an artist in Switzerland who was also painting ornamentation art with Welfi, excuse me, yes. Because there are some, I can see some similarities in the way he, yes. But there I think there was a there was the networks of curators, museum curators that promoted his art. But in the case of Čiurlionis, it's totally different because of the ideology and all these political evolutions. There couldn't be such. Unusual. The folk, which is. And I recall now that Wróbelau Wróbel is also mentioned in the early symbolist reception. Thank you very much.
Okay, we still do have 3 minutes for 1 or 2 questions, I guess. So anybody? Any questions? I do have one. My question is actually, which interpretation do you think is the most correct, and which one do you personally associate?
This is a very difficult question because we never perceive artists as they are, but through the lens of our own period. We are not outside time and space, and today we have that post-colonial discourses who are actual and try to integrate painters in the canon who are neglected, and I see quite a lot of elements of outsider art, of course, besides symbolism and art nouveau. I'm looking forward to the excursion tomorrow to see the works in original. I haven't seen them in original. I used reproductions, and I want to make an impression tomorrow what to say about him. But I will publish a volume on the so-called naive art, autodidactic art, and how it was put in different contexts in South America, in the socialist Yugoslavia, in the Soviet Union, and Čiurlionis will play also in this discourse as an exemplary artist who had that shift in reception that can be compared to other artists from this perspective. There are always perspectives. We never can say the artist was this way, but we are bound to our time and space.
Okay, thank you very much.